All right, guys, real quick disclosures here. Hifiman did send this out for a review. They are not paying, asking, or otherwise trying to influence me to say anything good or bad about this headphone. All thoughts and opinions are my own. Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh, and today we're going to be talking about two different headphones. The Hifiman Arya, a personal favorite of mine, and the HE1000se. Now, if you haven't caught either of these reviews, I'll put both links in the description down below. And because these are coming in at two very different price ranges, $1,600 versus $3,500, this is going to be partially a comparison, but also kind of an upgrade guide on whether or not you should upgrade from the Arya or an equivalent headphone to the HE1000se, but it's mainly for the comparison. Yes, I'm aware that's unfair, but if you have the choice between the two, I think these are vastly different and distinct sound signatures, and I might want to direct you towards the correct one for you. Now, before we talk about the comparison between these two headphones, I do want to talk about something that I missed in the HE1000se review, which is going to be amplification. The Arya is a far more demanding headphone in terms of what it needs to drive it. The HE1000se is what I would consider to be less revealing and actually pretty efficient, and it doesn't need a whole lot to drive it. However, given the sound signatures, I actually like two different styles of amps for them. So for the Arya, I prefer something like this. This is a Monoprice 887. It's a very, very clean, ultra low distortion solid state amplifier, and I prefer something like this for the Arya. I like something super clean but powerful going into it. And for the HE1000se, I actually prefer something like this, which is the HIFI IDST Pro, but this is a tube hybrid. Not a whole lot of power, but the SE thankfully doesn't need it. But it does add some kind of slight tube distortion, a little bit of inherent warmth to your headphones. And the SE, while a big portion of the SE is going to be the detail retrieval, I still think that even with something a little bit smoother on the top end than a solid state would be, especially something like that 887, the details in this are so good and so far ahead of everything else that it can deal with a little bit of loss and you still get a more detailed experience, but you get a little bit more added warmth in the mid-range and the lower end, which is what I really, really like with this headphone. So I didn't talk about that in the review, so here it is now. But to keep everything fair, I judged them on the same solid state amplifier, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing is going to be build. They might on the surface level look like the same headphone, but in terms of build and magnet structure, they're actually quite a bit different. So the use of metal on the HE1000 is more prevalent and in my opinion, higher quality metals than the Arya. The Arya has a plastic frame, and it actually is a fairly lightweight and what I would consider to be a very comfortable headphone. The HE1000se is it's a pretty lightweight planar, especially on the top end of price, but it's a little bit heavier than the Arya is. And I'm also not sure if the clamp force is slightly stronger on the SE or if the pads are slightly thicker, but this headphone doesn't feel as comfortable to me, and it's a little bit more clampy than the Arya. The Arya has more of like a sit on top of your head type of feel with just a hair of clamp force. This feels a little bit more clampy, although neither are what I would consider to be uncomfortable. Both are very comfortable headphones, and given the size of the planar that's in here, fairly lightweight too. So in terms of the magnet structure, they're both quite a bit different. The Arya uses a dual-sided planar magnetic structure where they actually use asymmetrical magnets. So they have large magnets in the back and these small thin magnets in the front running horizontal to the driver. And the driver on the SE is actually quite a bit different, where they do have symmetrical magnets, but they are the stealth magnets. So instead of being straight squared off bars, they're kind of these rounded bars that run horizontal, and they're larger in scale. Now earlier I was talking about how the pads have a slightly different feel, and visually under close inspection, they are pretty much the same pad. They don't feel any thicker or softer on one or the other, but in my experience, they do have a slightly different feel to them on head. So regarding the general sound signatures of both of these headphones, they go about the same task in drastically different ways and provide two, in my opinion, very good but very different results. So I find the Arya to be quite a bit warmer and quite a bit wider. And I mean wider as in kind of the depth and the staging capability of the Soundstage. And you feel, in my opinion, much more immersed in the world. The HE1000 has a focus on details and kind of forcing those details in a very closed-in space, at least in comparison to the Arya. Now, it also has a higher focus in the upper regions of the mid-range and the treble response, and that's where the majority of those details are coming in, whereas the Arya kind of has the flip, where it's kind of more focused in the bass response slash lower mid-range, and a little bit in the upper mid-range, but primarily in the bass to lower mid-range areas. Those areas specifically are the areas that I find the Arya to be the best at. Now, before we jump into this, I want to make my biases really clear here. I preferred and still prefer the Arya. It is by far my favorite headphone of all headphones at any price, and it's still my favorite, but there are definitely some qualities that the HE1000 has that the Arya does not come anywhere close to. But there are some qualities that the Arya has that the HE1000 doesn't have, thus the comparison. So the treble response is one of those areas that is vastly different. So the Arya has the ability to be a fairly detailed headphone while not coming across like it's trying to force anything at you. It's got this kind of soft treble delivery where everything is, you feel like you have everything in the picture, but it doesn't seem forced. So a good comparison would be the HE1000se, which has everything in the picture, but it feels very forced. This, I feel like I can get almost the same amount of information as the 800S, but it's in a lot more pleasing of a package. Timbre characteristics are also something that I want to slightly touch on. I do find this to be a bit more pleasing in terms of timbre, but I don't know if it's more accurate. I think the HE1000 might be more accurate, but ultimately that can lead to some unpleasantness depending on what is creating the actual sound. So the treble response on the flip side of this is going into that more forced category. And forceful as it is, it meets it with an equal amount of detail and resolution. And in the review, and I still stand by this, this is the most detailed headphone that I've heard to date. Now, that being said, I find this to be occasionally unpleasant, especially if you get a little bit higher in volumes. And as I recommended in the review, listening to moderate volumes is preferred on this because everything is a little bit more even, and the upper mid-range and the treble response seem to scale a little bit higher than the bass response and the lower mid-range do as you increase volume. Now, that being said, the treble response on here is, in terms of technicality, extremely admirable. It is one of the most precise and quick and fast sounding treble responses that I've heard. And I mean, it is $3,500, so you'd expect it to do some magical things. And I think it delivers on that promise. The difference between these two is really just going to come down to a pleasing experience versus a more technical and precise experience. And my preference personally leans towards pleasing, but that may be different with you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get onto the mid-range, and these handle mid-range in vastly different ways. This, again, is going to come at it from a perspective of ultimate precision. It's going to be telling you everything wrong, every little pop and nick in the vocalist track. It's going to be displaying all of that information. The Arya, on the flip side, is more focused on presentation. And because of its ability to soundstage and have an incredibly deep forward representation of the background music, it has a separation factor that is unmatched from the HE1000. The vocalist in the Arya is just so much more forward and seems physically almost isolated from the background music, whereas the HE1000se, you can actually almost tell the different tracks position. Like, it's the ability to see the recording on the HE1000 is so strange and so unlike most other headphones, where it's almost like you are just listening to these layers of tracks, which is exactly what you're listening to, but you feel like it. The Arya, though, sells the experience quite a bit better and is able to deliver a vocalist that sounds alive within a room that it's being displayed in, and it's honestly quite lovely. Now, it also has a stronger emphasis on the lower mid-range, which can occasionally, very rarely, if the song is recorded poorly, will result in a little bit of boxiness, and the HE1000 will not have that. But this also avoids significant sibilance in the S regions, even for particularly poor recorded tracks. Sometimes things like David Bowie's Space Oddity gets a little bit hot in the S region, and the Arya handles that beautifully, whereas this is a little bit more painful, even though it's a little bit more honest from what the recording is actually showing. Now, Bass response is going to be next up, and the bass response here, this is actually something that I consider the Arya to be a far better technically at, though the detail retrieval aspect definitely goes more in line with the HE1000se. The HE1000se's bass response is going to be a bit more dynamic, and it's going to be sometimes stronger and sometimes softer depending on the recording. And don't get me wrong, the Arya is capable of that too, but this feels a bit more reactive and responsive to what the music is doing than that. However, the Arya has more bass, and the bass delivery is of the headphones I've heard, honestly one of my favorite, and that's one of my favorite aspects of the Arya. The bass response almost seems kind of omnipresent. It feels more akin to a subwoofer being placed separately from the actual headphones, because you have tracks that have this bass response that seems to come from not the headphones, whereas you always feel like you're listening to the headphones on the SE. And it just always seems like it's kind of coming from right here. The bass response in the Arya is more kind of invisible and see-through in a sort of way. You can still definitely hear it a lot, but it doesn't seem to be obstructing the music, or sometimes even doesn't even seem to be coming from a source that's right here. That selling effect is very good. Now for the imaging in the soundstage. I find these to be about equal in terms of imaging, although the Arya has a lot more space to work with and is far wider and far deeper in terms of soundstage. And I actually consider the soundstage position to be definitely my preference, and I think a lot of people's preference on the Arya. It's just a far more enjoyable experience, and it actually really helps out with a lot of the positioning of instruments. They definitely feel, yes, less detailed than the HE1000se, but they feel far more natural in the song. They come alive in a way that the SE cannot quite display. So the conclusion of this, it's pretty simple. If you want a warmer, more enjoyable experience, or more classically enjoyable, more classically musical, I think the Arya is the way to go. If you want a hyper-technical, hyper-detailed sound, the 1000 is the way to go. And in the review of the H1000, I said that I found myself listening to the recording a lot more than I was listening to the music. And I feel like that is a perfect representation for this comparison. The Arya, I just get lost in. I listen to all of my music simply because it sounds phenomenal. The 1000, perhaps a bit more honest, but I find myself listening for all the issues, all of the flaws in the recordings, because they're just displayed so obviously with the SE. And don't get me wrong, both are very cool experiences, but again, my preference is always going to be the music. Okay guys, thanks very much for watching. Until the next video, my name's Josh, signing off.